Good morning, and welcome to the four pillars of self mastery, the foundation of dynamic leadership. Before we get into the four pillars of self mastery, I want to set some context, not to slow things down, but to make sure we're having the right conversation. The pace of change. The pace of change today isn't just fast, it's accelerating. And the magnitude of the pivots leaders are being asked to make keeps increasing. Habits, leadership styles, decision patterns that once worked reliably are struggling to keep up with the speed of life as we know it today. What I see most often isn't a lack of intelligence or effort, it's a reliability problem. People can perform on a good day of a good week, but under pressure, surprise, or emotional load, access to judgment, clarity, and choice drops off. That's why leaders can no longer rely on their favorite leadership style, the one that feels most natural or comfortable. Things are moving too fast, information is too widely distributed, and people are making decisions based on intuition, thin slicing, and real time perception. What we're talking about today isn't another framework to memorize. It's not about fixing people, it's about something more: self mastery, what I also call personal leadership, because a person needs command of themselves before they can reliably and predictably influence others. Now, everything I'll share exists in established research, but much of it is in silos. My focus is integration, what leaders can actually use on a bad day of a bad week when conditions are not ideal. With that context, I want to introduce a simple but robust model, the four pillars of self mastery, and show how it underpins emotional intelligence, dynamic leadership, and reliable performance in times of change. This model will later be applied in the leadership series next month. The four pillars are not just for self mastery, they also form a dashboard that you can use to gauge the current state of your team, especially in times of change. Now, let's start with the four pillars. When I look at the four pillars of self mastery, a lot of it gets into what we've looked at from the past, what actually worked. If you consider the last few things that the last few initiatives that you started, you probably asked something like, what should I do first? Or where do I start? Or what should I do next? And often that question leads us, it basically primes us to look at what we've done before that has worked, as opposed to what's called the Merlin method, where you go to the end and then you work backwards. And often, if you go to the end of your outcome, what you want, and you work backwards to the beginning, what you'll find is that first step is often different than what you came up with when you said, "Where should I start?" Because where should I start activates that same thing that was activated the two times ago, three times ago, four times ago, etc. And this is why we see repeated behavior and over. It's not the only reason. There's a lot more, and that's why I use the four pillars. Now, I use a table to illustrate the four pillars because it's a foundation. It's not just a set of pillars. It's also the foundation for your life design, purpose. Most breakdowns aren't a lack of effort, as I said. They're structural. It comes from structural instability. Now, if you look at structures, clearly a one-legged table can support a lot, right? Especially if that leg is wide enough, it can support a ton, but it has to be balanced. It's stable until it's not. Imagine a one-legged table in a mild earthquake. It would be one of the first things to go. So we don't want to use that as our foundation. Obviously, a two-legged table isn't much better from forces this way and that way. This way, yeah, it's fine. And a three-legged table, while three is great for simplicity and flexibility, it's not so good for stability because you have these weak areas as that where it can fall between the two legs. So here's the four pillars on under the foundation. The first one is knowledge, and I have often said that to know and not do is to not know. And while that's not exactly accurate, it's essentially the experience, right? If you know something but you don't use it, it's not much better than not knowing at all. So while knowledge is not enough, it's often necessary because in order to get to the next three pillars, if you don't have enough, if you don't have the right knowledge, they won't make sense, or maybe you won't be justified in moving forward. The second one is habit mastery. And I get into habit mastery because without understanding the anatomy of habits and how they're structured and why they are what they are, it's very easy to believe that things are not available to us or that this is the same or I've tried that and been there, done that, it doesn't work. What I'm telling you here, what I'll tell you here today in habit mastery is there's a system that underlying all habits and the formation of habits initially, those habits that were formed from age 0 to 7. There's a structure in place, and that structure can be used to reset your habits. That's an important piece of information, and it's what enables us to then go to the next two pillars. The third pillar is state mastery. While I talk about this structure for habit mastery being a reliable process that you can use again and again, even on a bad day of a bad week, it does require you to have control of your state, mastery of your state. And that's why I put that third. If I put state mastery second, then we would say, well, there's only so much I can do. But once you understand the structure of a habit, you'll also see, oh, wow, I was going after my state change or my state mastery the wrong way. There is a better way to do it. And I don't mean to say somebody's right or wrong. What I'm saying is that there are paradigm shifts that are underway. Some of them are quite far along. We're just not aware of them because it's still sitting in the research lab. But those paradigm shifts have enabled us to see things about the brain that we didn't know just 50 years ago. And understanding what's going on in the brain has opened the door to this habit mastery. That's why I cover it second. And then we come back to state mastery. So it's sort of like the things that you've done before that didn't work, we need to revisit them with this new lens. And then the fourth one, this was inspired by watching a person who was highly skilled in the area of managing themselves, but still got knocked off track. And the reason they got knocked off track was something that happened years and years and years ago, long before they were in business. And what the observation is that if you have areas where there's resentment or there's residue of some interpersonal issue, and I'm not talking about mental health here. So if I use the word little like trauma or little t, I'm not talking about the kind of trauma that you're thinking about in terms of mental health. I'm just talking about something as simple as a kid getting their ice cream cone knocked out of the hand by a person who loves them, and while it's accidental, that person found it funny and laughed. That could be this painful moment for this child that gets associated to all kinds of things. Ice cream brings it up. Maybe going out with somebody they care about brings it up. Maybe somebody bumping them brings it up. And now you have all these associations. What I'm suggesting is that forgiving those things in the past, it's not a morality issue. It's more about performance hygiene. In other words, if I don't forgive myself and I don't forgive others and close any of those open associations, then I run the thing triggering one of those past associations. So by forgiving, now it doesn't mean, and I'll get into this more when I get to that pillar, but it doesn't mean forgive and continue to receive harm. The point is, there's after forgiveness, you have choices. You can forget it, but I think more productively, you can set boundaries. So you can forgive and set boundaries immediately, or you can forgive and wait to see if it happens again. And if it happens again, set boundaries. or you can wait to see if it happens a third time and then set boundaries. But each time, I would say the boundaries that get set needs to be a little stronger, because if it happens three times, we know that 95% of our actions are by habit. So chances are it's going to happen again. So those are the four pillars: knowledge, habit mastery, state mastery, and forgiveness. And I basically spilled my candy in the lobby on the forgiveness one, but we'll talk about it some more there. So here's the knowledge pillar. As you can see right here, it's sense making, it's orientation to reality. What's true? And the way the habit system works, which you'll see, is that we can take perception with the wrong meaning and turn that into being true and run with it. And because of things like confirmation bias, it could then take on a life of its own. Confirmation bias is one of the most problematic ones, because if you hear something from a reliable source three times, we automatically look to that source as credible and reliable. And let me state that if you hear something that is true and reliable three times, then we automatically assume that that source is credible and reliable. And it takes up to 11 disconnects or 11 iterations before we start to doubt that source. Well, guess what? Your perception has become a source. And if the things that you've perceived are true, then it makes that perception, right, a credible, reliable source. And we go through life taking our perception and meaning as true. And while it may most often be true, we have to have a way to cut the deck. We have to have a way to say, wait a minute, let me just check this another way. That gets into understanding how habits are formed, and we'll talk about that some more then. So here's a model that I use, the 7 Performance Series. You may have seen this if you've seen any of my content. And this is more of a structure that I use to help people understand how do you get from where you are to where you want to be. It's aligned with be, do, have. It's aligned with agency. It's aligned with taking charge of the things that you can control before trying to take charge of the things that you can't control. And then there's physical, spiritual, and emotional. So these are the first three areas. And I say that these are the ones that are in our control. You can't have agency if you don't have control of these. Now, it's easier to get control over mental and physical and spiritual. And in spiritual, I'm not talking about the spiritual realm. I'm talking about our spiritual self, our higher self, however you want to define that. You could say it's our part of us that interacts with the spiritual realm, whatever you want to say. But this is us. In other words, it's our control. We get to choose and decide if, for example, we want to live by faith. And if we want to live by faith, we can choose and decide what doctrine we want to follow. So these three are easily managed. While emotional you may, on an from an intellectual standpoint, say, yeah, emotional is in our control. But if you get hijacked and triggered, you don't feel like you're in control of your emotions. The emotions are running away. I've heard people describe it as, yeah, when something happens, I feel like somebody takes over my life and I can't get it back until, hours later or even days later. They take control of it and they do things and say things, and I'm not in control. Again, I'm not talking about mental health. The point is, if a person is emotionally hijacked, you don't know what it's taking them back to. And if there's a triggered event or phobia, something like that happened from age 2, 3, or 4, and they get taken back to that space and the threat is as high. So remember, the subconscious treats threats like a tiger on the Serengeti. Most threats that we're encountering are not at that level. So to get hijacked at that level doesn't really make sense. And it puts us into fight or flight when really what we need to be doing with agency is focus and engage. So I don't care what's going on around you. And they depict this very well in the movies. And you look at special ops like Black Hawk Down, that was a great movie. You look at Rangers and SEALs and how they function, SEAL Team 6, etc. These movies, they depict it very well. I've trained with SEALs, I've been an Army Ranger, and they essentially in the training, they kind of break that conditioned stimulus response that leads to fight or flight, and it turns into focus and engage. And that focus and engage gives you access to your skills. Whereas if you're in fight or flight, things narrow down and you lose access to what you know and what you can do. Now the next area, relationships and professionals. So these are obviously not 100% in our control. We can influence them, but they involve other people. Even if you are in business for yourself, there's still buyers and suppliers, right? So you these this is where things can go awry, and this is why I talk about forgiveness, because you can have this locked in. You can be 100% bad day of a bad week, I got it, but a certain kind of relationship takes you off kilter, and now you're going down this rabbit hole that you didn't mean to go down. And the reason this is so important is because anxiety spirals definitely feel like you're out of control. They definitely feel like someone else is running the ship, driving the ship, and you're just along for the ride. And I would say this is just an observation and working with many people is that sometimes people don't want to go after that real goal or go after that real purpose because they've been hurt or they've anxiety spiraled in such a way, and that's such a painful experience, and the fallout is so large that they don't ever want to do that again. And so they resist crossing that line into the next level of difficulty. They just believe that they're not capable. It's just who I am. And what I'll show you today is why that's not true and why you don't have to accept it. That's part of this four pillars of self mastery is that you have to let go of the past. Another thing that keeps people back is that, and it's similar, is that in order to get to second base, you have to leave first, using a baseball metaphor. And first base includes baggage that people don't want to let go of. You've got to let go of that baggage. And now, what's interesting is for years, I looked at patterns. I tried to look for what is present for these people who've had certain successes. And one of the things that showed up often was that they lost everything. One could believe that you have to lose everything in order to be successful, and it's not true. What you have to do is let go of the baggage and let go of the paradigms and let go of the beliefs that don't serve you at the next level. You can't take that stuff to the next level. As another way of saying that the problems you got yourself into, that level of thinking is not adequate to get to that next level. It's a similar concept. Now, this financial is the seventh. So you have mental, physical, spiritual, emotional, relationship, professional, and the financial is the seventh. But I also put outcome because financial is often not the end. Financial is a means to the end. And too often people get caught up in the goal of financial and it's a moving target. And next thing you know, people just get down this path of greed, corruption, or whatever, just because they're trying to fill that void that they're calling financial, but it's really something deeper. So we have to ask that question why multiple times to understand what that outcome is. And when I work with the person, I always start with purpose. What's a purpose? And people don't always have facility to come up with what's their purpose. But what I do is I use a proxy for purpose, and that serves the us to get through here. And once we do a few laps of this, and they start getting some agency, and they're able to question their own perceptions and meaning, and check it, not to question it to just be off balance, but to just make sure that they're moving through with the right uh, perception and perspective. And once they have this agency and then they have this, it's easier for them to start looking at what's my purpose because they believe it's achievable. It doesn't have all these things attached to it, this pain, etc. So the next one is so that's knowledge that comes into knowledge because we start with the seven performance areas, and that's to give us a common language because I also use it as a diagnostic tool. It's a diagnostic tool for me to see where's the weak link. And then, but because I have a common language with the client, we can talk about it from that perspective. So the next one is habit mastery. And this is huge. Now, if I just go talk to people, and again, my audience is generally speaking over 50 years old because I also have a passion for transformation after 50. And these two work together because the content applies to both. One is more about transformation, and the other one is about high performance, and those two go together. But the when I talk about habit change, people will feel like either I know how to change habits, I'm fine with where I am, or they come up with, yeah, but that's not for me. I've tried it. I've read all the books. I've done all the things. Those are two extreme responses. But either way, what it does is it gets a person to put habit change or habit mastery aside and say that's not for me for whatever reason, whether they feel like they're already a master or they feel like it's not for them. What I would say is that there are different types of habits. There are behavioral habits, and those are the ones that most people with experience have figured out how to manage. Like you may have a habit of eating chocolate candy, but when you hit a certain weight line, you stop that. I'm not going to go do that anymore. You may have a habit of scrolling on social media, but when something comes up and you need to put the phone down, you can put it down. It's not an addictive type habit, although it's a habit. And those don't really cause problems. And there's no reason, a person may not see any reason for them to go down this rabbit hole of more work to be able to solve that, because it's not an issue. But then there's the other kind of habits. And I think, so those were behavioral. The other kind of habit would be reactive. And I think these are the ones that are overlooked, because I've seen leaders with full intention get triggered and off on a bad path and making mistakes because they reacted to something that came up that they were not ready for. That is a reactive habit. That is a habit. That is a habit pattern that people ignore because they think it's just my personality. And that's the next one. The next set of habits are identity type habits. And that would be like personality, identity. Those are the types of habits that cause, that's what dictates your life, right? Your personality is essentially what opens doors for you and closes doors for you. And personality, people don't realize it because we look at it as a summary. Personality, I should say, personality is a summary, so people don't look at it as a habit. But when you break down what that personality is, it's a set of elements, many, many elements, which we'll illustrate in a few minutes. So here's what's going on with habit mastery. This is what I call the 1 second model. It's part of my larger framework of the 7 step reset, which I have here. The 7 step reset are the 7 steps that apply in the stimulus response cycle. And since we have about 30,000 stimulus response cycles a day, it makes sense to understand it. Now, you may think, what? But here's the thing. If you look up how many decisions are made in a day, you'll get something like 33,000. Then you add on the piece that 95% of everything we do is done by habit, and you'll get to, okay, 31,000 stimulus response cycles. That's where I'm getting that. And I don't want to change my 95% by habit. What I want to do is reduce the number of stimulus response cycles I have per day, reduce the number of stimuli that rise to the level of potential threat, and I want to have more agency over the stimuli that I choose to respond to. And that's the 7 step reset, which I'll talk about in a few minutes. So this would be steps 1 and 2 on this side and steps 4 through 7 on this side. But let's just focus on step 3 for now. Here's what people miss. This line right here is the stimulus. This is where the stimulus comes in. Well, there's already been a pre-listening. We're constantly pre-listening. And in that pre-listening phase, the brain is trying to predict what kind of stimuli may I encounter wherever I'm going. There's a neuroscience point that if you walk through a doorway, you get a moment of calm because the brain is looking around and scanning to figure out, okay, this is a change setting, what's possible, what's, just trying to figure out what could come in. Then you have the 1/4 second reaction time. This is the reaction time between the subconscious comes online. So if you look up what's the reaction time of the subconscious, it'll say 1/4 second. Now, I use subconscious and network of neurons interchangeably because it has to map to what people are used to talking about, but I will not call it a mind because it's not a mind, it's a network of neurons. And that's part of what we're dissecting right here in this slide. So this 1/4 second is not the network of neurons waiting because it's slow. The network of neurons is processing at 11 million bits per second. This first 1/4 second, that's where cognitive biases come in. That's where priming can come in. That's where, like on those, the research that shows how people responded to a gender or ethnicity question, and that influenced how well they did on the exam, the standardized exam. That's all happening here. It's it's taking the pre-listening, using the initial detection and figuring out, okay, what does this mean? It's applying meaning to it. And then it hands off, it goes to the next stage, which is, okay, we have to react to this. We have to stay safe. We got to stay alive. What's the path of least resistance? This is where habits come in. This is the reactive habit. This is the identity or personality. What's the path of least resistance? That path of least resistance is not mental. That path of least resistance is neurobiological. It's neural pathways, which are made up of neurons connected with synapses. So we have 100 billion neurons. They are connected. Each one is connected to anywhere from 1,000 to 10,000 other neurons. We have trillions and trillions of connections. And these are associations because neurons that fire together wire together. So that's what's happening here. The ones that the path of least resistance is a well myelinated neuron. So myelin, and this wasn't really talked about in the context of neuroscience improvement until like after the 1950s. So this is why I say that the brain scanning tools, we didn't have them before. We didn't have them to be able to understand what's actually going on, which is why the philosophers from the last few centuries called it a mind. They called it a subconscious mind because they didn't understand that this was brain processing, and that brain processing is not mental. It's neural pathways interacting with one another, and those neural pathways is more physiological than it is mind. In fact, it's all physiological, and what's going through the neural pathways is energy. So and again, at 11 million bits per second. So the path of least resistance is a well myelinated neural pathway. That's a habit. This is why your reactions are similar from year to year to year for a particular stimulus. That's why your personality tends to be the same because it's a well myelinated set of neural pathways. Now, it's difficult to change myelination. You're not going to just go in and unmyelinate the neurons, but what you can do is start a new pathway. And you start that new pathway by myelinating different set of neurons, and the synapses is there connecting them. And that is done with what's called deep practice, which we get into in the workshop. The other piece that happens that people aren't aware of, because most habit literature talks about it like it's a mind, is that the reason why replacing a habit is so much easier than breaking a habit is because you have the myelin and then you have the synapse. And the more attention you put into it, the more you continue to myelinate that and the more you keep the synapse focused. When you build a new neural pathway, what happens is the synapse, it's called synaptogenesis. It's like a pruning process. The synapses moves from the unused neural pathway to the one that you're building and activating. This is why we talk about activating. You've activated something. So a neural pathway can actually go dormant because there's no synapses. But the brain, again, is processing 11 million bits per second, and that synaptogenesis can happen in milliseconds. Neuroplasticity, I would say, majority happens overnight because there's actually more of that pruning going on. But in an instant, you can activate a dormant neuron, and the brain will put synapses in there because, again, it's for life and death. So it's going to take whatever energy it needs. It's going to populate that neuron, that neural pathway with synapses, and now it's activated. And we're going to talk about that when it comes to leaders setting context and how that can activate something that you didn't mean to activate. But it's why the research can show that an Asian American girl who answers an ethnicity question first on the heading will do better on the math exam, and that and Asian American girls who are first presented with the gender question do worse. And that has to do with Americans thinking that girls are not as smart as boys when it comes to math. And it also, and then the other side of that is the narrative that Asians are better at math than Americans. So whichever question came first actually changes the results of the test because it got activated. And you can see how that's happening here in this pre-listening. This pre-listening is a constant. Then you have the initial detection, and then you have the path of least resistance. So all of that is what leads to that priming thing. And then, and here's the big deal right here, it hands it off to the conscious mind. So this side is 11 million bits per second. The conscious mind has a reaction time of about a half second. This is only processing at 50 bits per second. So if you just automatically take the reaction and turn it into a response, and you've done that in a very short period of time, even a quarter of a second, you've only processed, the conscious mind has only processed 12 and a half bits of information. And I'm using the data that says 50 bits per second is the processing speed. So we need at least a pause, but when a person is triggered, there's no pause. This goes right over to here. And then the conscious mind is fully engaged and it makes a decision of what to do next. That's the conscious thought. So I call this the 1 second model. And on this side of the line, you have the neural signal. And the reason I moved it over here is because this is the process. If you do it right, that full conscious thought is not over here because you have to make the assessment and decision. It's kind of like circling to make sure I understand it right. Because just like the subconscious or the network of neurons created meaning over here, the conscious mind should be checking meaning over here. And that's why I put the line there. But the point is, this side is a signal, energy flowing through neural pathways. This side is the conscious mind that actually has thought and can relate the unrelated and can design into the field of infinite possibility. Something that the neuron side can't do because it's associations, and by definition, associations are majority things in the past. You could have things in the future that if you use visualization, but generally speaking, we're talking about the past. And if you're doing something new, which is the world today, because every day it seems like something new we have to deal with, and if you're using an old template, well, you're going to get less than optimized solutions. All right, so that is the overview of the model. Now, here's what happens. So I talked about the 7-step reset. You have steps 1 and 2, that's like self-development and then state management, and then steps 4 through 7. This is your response, the action. It includes emotional modulation and then return to mindfulness, because we have to come back and do it again. Remember, I said 33,000 times a day we're going through a stimulus response cycle. So if we don't finish in mindfulness, we're already potentially part the way triggered for that next one that comes in, and it's going to color the meaning. It's going to change how we respond. So we want to have that return to mindfulness. So we sometimes just slowing things down will do wonders. And you can do this with breathing. Breathing is one of the best gateways to this kind of thing. This is what happens when you don't slow it down. And if a person is triggered, this is what it looks like. They're not doing any steps 1 and 2. There is no state management. There's no assessment. There's no diagnostic about what's my state and do I need to get back on track? Am I falling into a fixed mindset, get back to a growth mindset? Am I being primed to some direction that is not useful for me? None of that's happening because the conditioning, the conditioned reaction leads to the next stimulus. And that leads to the next stimulus. So you're going stimulus, reaction, stimulus, reaction, stimulus, reaction. It's not even stimulus response because it's just the reaction is the response, which just caused another stimulus, etc. And steps 4 through 7, which would be stimulus to action to emotional stimulus to emotional modulation if needed to action to mindfulness, is non-existent. So this is what triggered looks like. Now the solution is you can't suppress it, you can't stop it, you can't change the response. It's already done. It's processing 11 million bits per second. By the time you're even aware that it's not something you want, you're already sitting in a deep hole. So what you can do though is slow down the next stimulus. You can push off that next stimulus. Now, in the moment, because the subconscious processes by in so much in milliseconds, and because it's often life or death, it's thinking that this threat is existential. What can happen is it's fighting for its life, and you try to slow it down by slowing down the old reaction. You try to slow this one down, it's not going to happen. But if you accept that most of the threats that you've encountered in your life are not tigers on the Serengeti, most of the threats are not existential, they are inconveniences. If you can get that through your head, through your mind, and embrace that, then it gives you some room to where you can, you know what, I'm going to slow down the next stimulus that's coming. I'm going to stand up and I'm going to walk over and look out the window and see what comes up for me. And that could be just something you do as a leader. You can still be listening, you'll still be engaged in the meeting, but you just stand up, walk over to the window, look thoughtful, and that's slowing things down. These are things that I've done, right? Or you can just tell the person, if you're the leader and they're reporting to you, you know what? Let's take that offline. I'm in the middle of something right now, but I'll get back to you. Let's meet in a half hour. Whatever you have to do to slow down that next stimulus, because the next stimulus at that speed is not coming from outside, it's coming from inside. And you have to slow yourself down because you are peppering, and you know what? Your subconscious, your network of neurons, it doesn't know the buttons to push, but the buttons that get pushed to get your attention are the path of least resistance. So you might as well say it knows what buttons to push. And this is I can go down the path of artificial intelligence, but some of that is what's going on there too. It's not that it knows what buttons to push; it's that those buttons are the path of least resistance, and because neurons that fire together wire together, it's a sequence that takes off and goes running. So here is the place where I want to first look at. So what we've got is at the top, you have identity. Now, I already said identity and personality, that's a summary, and they're made up of elements. And what this is depicting is that identity is very, very much a construct. And there are a lot of elements in that construct. But the perception of people, that's what this side is. The perception that people have that its elements is very, very low. Most people don't think of identity as a set of elements, nor do they think of anxiety as a set of elements. They see them as constructs, they see them as summaries. This also shows that most people try to change the identity at the summary level. You can't change the identity at the construct or the summary level. You have to change it at the elements level. The other thing that this graph is depicting is at the bottom, I have the opposite. So if I said muscle memory, most people understand that most muscle memory can be changed, right? You can change the elements to get different muscle memory. You change the moves and it aggregates up to a construct or a summary movement. And that movement is done with a series of micro movements that have been trained. And that's where the muscle memory comes from. And the point is that muscle memory is not muscle memory, it's actually nervous system memory. Here's the aha that I'm making on this slide. The same neural pathways or the same way that neural pathways are used to create muscle memory, aka nervous system memory, is the same way that neural pathways are used to create identity, personality, anxiety, emotional regulation. And most people who are in the change behavior business understand this intuitively. They've seen this, but what they don't have is this understanding that identity is a summary or a construct. And the reason is because of what I'll show you here to illustrate it. Let's see. If I draw a line, and remember, this is think of this as the 7 phases, right? This is the 1 second model. Think of this as the 1 second model. And this is that line that gets crossed from neurons to conscious mind. On this side, you have the construct. You have the elements that make up muscle memory. Now, people get it when we're talking about muscle memory because they say, oh, yeah, I did these things and I practiced these steps, and now I can do this compilation of these steps and moves, and I can do it successfully. But when I take the conversation to personality, the same is true. So what we have is the construct and we have the elements. So as we go through that 7 phases and we get to that line that says, okay, the network of neurons is going to take all of this 11 million bits per second worth of information. It's going to package it into a thought that can be perceived by the conscious mind. And this is what I was talking about, where when it crosses over, it's perceived as truth because it came from inside. But remember, over here, we had meaning, we had cognitive biases, we had path of least resistance, we had meta programs, we had priming, all of that was influencing it. And we also have our state, right? Because if you are already stressed, you're more likely to have a fight or flight response or reaction than you are to have a focus and engage. So again, the construct would be personality, identity, anxiety, and it's like muscle memory. The elements, in this case, it's movements, is what are the movements. And when it comes to personality or identity and those things, there's a plethora of elements that go in here, but they're all very small associations that we can work on. So this to me is an important perspective because it's an important perspective because when I'm working with a person, I want to go from here and work our way up to where they see not only their own identity as a compilation of elements or a summary of elements, but they can spot the elements in others. Now, you're not going to know all of the elements, but what you can do is you can know when things change, and that's the first step of mastery is to be able to spot those things in yourself and others. Now, the next one is state mastery, real time agency, maintaining access to choice in the present moment. This is where we make the difference of being able to respond appropriately on a bad day of a bad week. It's where we are able to access all of what we are capable of. This is why I call this foundational to dynamic leadership, because if you can't manage your own state, guess what? You are contributing to the chaos because you're in fight or flight and you're trying to have somebody else access calm and capability, but you're generating more of that because if you're the leader, they're looking at you and they've got their pre-listening going on and they're just saying, wow, that person is nervous. I'm even more nervous now. This is why you have to have that self-mastery. The other thing that happens is your interpretation of what you're getting from them has to be managed and controlled. So again, we know that for us that we haven't seen very many tigers as a threat. That person is in the same boat. They haven't seen that many tigers as a threat. But if they're reacting like it's a tiger, you have to look at that for what it is. So let's keep moving along here. So I want to get back to that point. So this is another view of that conditioned reaction, conditioned reaction, conditioned reaction. What I said is step 2, the pre-stimulus collapses. And I told you I would get back to that 7-step reset. So step 2 is where we slow it down. You can't slow it down by suppressing it. It's too late. 11 million bits per second, and now it's transferred over the thought to something that can be perceived by the conscious mind, and you can't go backwards. Not as adults. We're not going backwards. And so step 2 can be used on the next one. So think about it like you're going to take out this conditioned reaction, this conditioned reaction, and this conditioned reaction because these are artificial. These are coming from inside. If it was a tiger, it would be coming from outside, and you would have to do things to save yourself from the tiger. But if these conditioned reactions are just coming from associations that are popping up because you got spooked, then you got to slow them down. You have to stop the internal ones, which is why getting up and going to the window is not that big of a deal because these things are coming at you rapid fire. You getting up, going to the window is measured in seconds. Those things are happening in milliseconds. And even a pause, if you're talking and you feel like yourself or you're listening and you feel yourself, that energy rising up, just pause. 2 seconds in a conversation is nothing. It's not even noticeable. People spend 2 seconds in between words when they're talking. So 2 seconds is nothing. Give yourself that 2 seconds to slow down that next one that's coming, because remember, the next one that's coming, if you're being triggered, is coming from inside, not outside. So this is the 7 steps. This puts it together. So this first step is your understanding, the beliefs, neuroplasticity, priming, mindset, physiology. That's why I call it self-development. We have to work on ourselves all the time, but every day you wake up, you're kind of at a set point for your step 1. You're not going to be changing your step 1 multiple times through the day going up. You may be able to get it back to baseline homeostasis, but you're not going to improve it in moments, right? You have a baseline And then the point is how much of that baseline can I access? And that's step two. So step two is not only a process of getting back on track, managing my state, but it's a diagnostic. It's like a dashboard to see where am I? Am I falling into limiting beliefs? Am I working on the habits that I need to work on? So one of the things with habit change, once you put the neuroplasticity in place, the remnants of that old neural pathway is still there. And sometimes you'll get a stimulus and those remnants say, hey, come on, do it this way, do it this way. You have to, after you get the understanding, you still have to open the door and go through it. The neuroplasticity is not necessarily going to make you go through the door. You have to do that choice. And eventually, going through the door becomes the path of least resistance and it becomes automatic. That's the automaticity. But in the gap, in the transition, you have to still make the choice. When I work with somebody to stop saying ums, they'll first tell me, oh, yeah, I notice them now. I notice that I'm saying, okay, well, now you have to do that next step and choose a pause instead of the This is part of the training that we go through with that. But you'll see that they will say I said and that's just part of the process. It is just part of the process. But the more you come back and the more you get yourself to do it right, the faster the conversion is going to happen. And then we have steps 4 through 7. So this is the response. So I make it completely separate from step 3. Remember, step 3, that last phase is handing off that intended reaction to the conscious mind. And if the conscious mind treats it as the response, then the response equals the reaction. And this is where the triggering gets even worse. And I have step 5 is emotional modulation because we don't, step 6 is action. We don't want to act if we're being emotionally triggered. You have about 90 seconds to undo any hijacking, emotional hijacking. If you don't get the emotional hijacking resolved in about 90 seconds or so, it then becomes a neurobiological event. It's lodged in your network of neurons. It's now generating cortisol and adrenaline and all that just builds on it. But you can turn this around, and it doesn't take 90 seconds. It's just that that's sort of the limit because after that, it's moved on, right? The subconscious is processing so fast. And so we have to be able to do this quickly and on the fly in real time, take a few, and with practice, you'll be doing this in seconds or two. And because of the positivity exercise that we put in on the front end, which keeps the threat level down. It goes from about 80% threat to 20% threat with the positivity exercise because, like I said, there's not many tigers facing us in business. And that enables us to have fewer times where we have to actually emotionally modulate. And then you have the action and the 7th step. So this is another view of what we said, so with the little labeling on it: self-regulation, high heart rate variability, because heart rate variability correlates with willpower and discipline. When heart rate variability is low, your willpower is low, and there's more to it than that, but that's a good start. And then you have the reaction, the response, action, and mindfulness over here on the right side. So this is the agency view. And then again, another view of it. So you're getting your response, you go to the next one, you go to the next one, 30,000 times a day. So when I'm working with the person and I'm going through the 7 performance areas, the first thing I want to do is get this in place. I have to get this in place so they're getting back to a calm pre-stimulus, because it's very difficult to move the needle if everything we talk about is triggering internal reactions. And this could take weeks to get this to where it's manageable. And again, another view. So the conditioned reaction and handoff to conscious mind. The first 500 milliseconds or half a second is the conditioned reaction based on past experiences and habit patterns, which is the path of least resistance. Left to its own, is going to hand off to the conscious mind a summary of that based on what it came up with. And that's where we need to fill that pause in from an automaticity standpoint. And here's the slide that I wanted to get to be able to talk about how this works with respect to leaders. So here's that pre-listening. This is the same model as I showed you before, but it's this full 7 phases. You have pre-listening, then the stimulus comes in, initial detection, rapid appraisal. This is where your priming is going on and your cognitive biases, and then the path of least resistance is happening here, and then the reaction formation is built. So this is your half second. That's what's going on in the half second reaction time of the conscious mind. And to put it in perspective, just so you have a reference point, cats have a subconscious reaction, a network of neural reaction of about 80 milliseconds, so less than a tenth of a second. In fact, it can be as low as 50. Dogs have one about 150 milliseconds. And I bring that up because humans can get their reaction time to be about 150 milliseconds. That's what it is for athletes when they go through training. And because of the repetition, they're speeding up their reaction time. They get it down into the 150 millisecond range. But anyway, so by a half a second, we have the reaction formation, and that's that line. That's that line that I was talking about that crosses from the network of neurons signal through neural pathways to thought, which is also energy. It goes over to thought, which is also energy, but it's going from 11 million bits per second to 50 bits per second. And that, when it crosses that line, it's going from a signal to a thought that can be perceived by the conscious mind. Very, very important, because this is, we are, most people are just knocking on this door. They're so close to understanding this line, but because they treat this side as a mind, they don't recognize it as two separate sides. They're looking at all the stuff that's going on over here, and they're trying to reconcile it into what makes sense for a mind, because it's what's been the reality for the last few centuries. Is what they, if you're over 50, certainly what you learned in elementary school and high school and college, right? If you're a Gen Zer, it's something that you've heard differently. But even with the Gen Z, this line is not explained as for what it really is, because it's still calling this a mind. All the textbooks call this side a mind. And that's back to the summary versus the elements. And then we have the conscious side, pre-conscious surfacing. This is that first phase. This is why I want you to pause before you decide full conscious engagement. So this is like circling. Okay, I see what I'm getting. Let me circle it a little bit more. Let me circle it a little bit more, because information is coming in rapid fire, right? 12 and a half bits per quarter of a second is coming in. So at least wait a half a second to let some more information in. Then you have your conscious engagement, then the consolidation and action. And that is where the handoff goes to step 4 for the response. Now, the reason this is important is because if you think about things that are familiar, this is what we see. That's the 1 second. When you get into high stakes situations, and I use the live. I mean, I've experienced this. I experienced it real time going live when you have glitches and mistakes that happen. It can collapse. And what we want to do with agency is keep pushing it out, but you don't push it out by slowing down the reaction or the response that's already happened. You slow it down by slowing down what's coming, and just by taking a breath and pausing, because that what's coming is coming from the inside. It's not like I got a glitch, a technology glitch, and then another technology glitch, and then another technology glitch, and then another technology glitch. What's actually happening is there was one technology glitch, and then the associations were just piling on, and they kept on coming in. By changing my direction, by taking the breath, or the skills that we teach, by doing that, we automatically slow it down. And then this is what happens when a person is triggered at the bottom. You can see it can collapse. So what's collapsing is these things: the initial detection, the rapid appraisal, the meaning, the path of least resistance. And this is where you get into highly myelinated pathways, which is why people can see anxiety spirals. As a leader who's going into a meeting to set some context, and if you go back and listen to my introduction on this one, you'll see this is what I did. I was setting context, because when you do that, there's a pre-listening, and that setting context, which has positive intent. It could be that you're activating things that you don't want to activate. You may be focusing on, I don't want to activate X, Y, and Z, but if you're not careful, you'll be activating A, B, and C, and that can be just as detrimental. The other thing is, what may be working for one part of the audience is doing the opposite for another part of the audience. So introductions should be thought through and thought about from that perspective. I remember Millard Bennett, who I first started listening to in the 70s, a big public speaking guru, and what he said is that you want to write out your write out and memorize your introduction, and write out and memorize your close, because when you start speaking, not only are you activating the audience, you're activating yourself, and all this comes up. So you may, if you're a leader, you're probably familiar with this. You start talking at the beginning of a meeting, and next thing you know, you start throwing in tangents, because what you're speaking, you're on hyper alert now, and associations are kicking in, and it's causing you to say and do other things. So that is where we're slowing this down, because we don't want the trigger behavior. The big aha for me here is that those triggered associations are coming from inside, not outside. So you can't slow it down because you're not really dealing with the tiger. And then the last one is forgiveness. And as I said, I kind of spilled the candy in the lobby on this one. The point about the forgiveness is that we have to forgive ourselves, so that's not an open wound. We have to forgive others, so that's not an open wound, because we don't want those things coming up when it has nothing to do with it. Some of these wounds are 30 and 40 years old, and people, they're still driving people's behavior. You know, I have control issues, or people sabotage relationships because they're worried about being left or being hurt. These are Forgiveness will get past that, because once you can forgive, and it's easier to forgive if you can separate forgiveness and forget about forgive and forget. It's about forgiveness and then set boundaries, because we want to set boundaries. And on one end of the spectrum with boundaries, it's like, I'm never going over there again. That's your own boundary. I'm never going to go there again. Another part of the boundary may be, I'm never going to drink in public again. Another part of the boundary might be, I'm always going to drive my own car, or I'm always going to have my phone so I can call an Uber. I'm never going to leave my phone home. Whatever those are self boundaries. Not even getting into the other boundaries, right? When you say this, it causes me to feel that, I'm going to ask you to stop doing that. That's nonviolent communication. And then by forgiving and then giving yourself the power to create boundaries, you limit the amount of triggering that's going to happen because of relationships. Because this is the one where, after you have all this agency down here, you can still get knocked off center by what's happening in relationships. And we need other people. We need involvement of other people for our success and for our outcome. Everything I talked about today fits into emotional intelligence, these first two bullets: self awareness and self management. These are the four pillars of emotional intelligence, not to be confused with the four pillars of self mastery. But you have to have self mastery to do self awareness to get it accurate. And you have to have self management so that you're able to get back to an even keel very quickly, and you're not getting triggered off into something that's not useful. And then your social awareness is going to be more accurate, and your relationship management will be more accurate. So here is the summary of the four pillars: knowledge, habit mastery, state mastery, forgiveness. And that becomes the foundation for your life design, your vision, your goals, your aspirations. And then here is a summary of the four pillars on one page. You take a screenshot of that. And remember, this model is not just something that I use as a roadmap. It's also a dashboard, so I can see where people are. As a leader, you can look at your team and see where they're breaking down, right? If a person is tired and they're low energy, you know they're going to be more prone to fight or flight than if they have positive energy. You can see if people are fine, and then a certain person comes in the room and they, things turn around. Back to this slide, one last thing to think about on that note is this pre listening. Think about it as a leader. How many times you've seen the expression on a person's face that they're anticipating something bad, and you still went on with your message? Hopefully, seeing this model, if you see that kind of angst on a person's face, your next thing would be, hey, let's first talk about what's going on. That's not just a cute thing to say. That's not just something that, oh yeah, this is good for relationship. It's prescriptive when you see that a person is about to jump into fight or flight and you haven't even started speaking yet, because that is going to influence everything. And then we have our close, which is this four pillars of self mastery is foundational to dynamic leadership, because you can't execute on dynamic leadership if you don't have self mastery. And as I've stated many times, that self mastery is not necessarily about dealing with the external stimulus that's coming in. It's about being able to slow down that internal stimulus that's coming from yourself from past conditioning. So that's where we are. Next week, I'll talk about the levers and the things that you can do in each one of the pillars to get a handle on it. We'll see you then.